Hello students. In the previous lecture, we discussed about Kenneth Walter's structural realism, also known as defensive realism. They are called defensive realists because they consider states' primary goals are security and survival, unlike the offensive realist like Mearsheimer. In this lecture, we will discuss about offensive realism that came as a reaction against Neo-Realism, or what we call defensive realism. Then we will discuss about Neo-Classical Realism that combines the best elements of Classical Realism and Neo-Realism. We will end our discussion with certain concluding remarks. So now let me focus on the offensive realism given by John Mearsheimer. So concentrating on war and strategy in his book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, John Mearsheimer theory of offensive realism is another variant of structural realism, but it provides a different kind of power politics that operate in the anarchical international system. So the structural realism or the arguments made by Kenneth Walters about structural realism, it is accepted by John Mearsheimer, but he is differing from him particularly on account of power dynamics that operate in the anarchical system. His theory is built on 5 main assumptions. The first assumption is that there is anarchy in the international system, which means that there is no hierarchically superior coercive power that can guarantee limits on the state behaviors. So he agrees with Walters that there is anarchy in international relations, but and this anarchy is the result of the absence of the world government, as there is no superior coercive power that can guarantee limits on the behavior of the states. So on the question of anarchy, both Walters and Mearsheimer, they are on the same page. Second, all great powers possess offensive military capabilities that they are capable of using against the other states. So on this point you can you can make a differentiation between Mearsheimer and Walters, because particularly Mearsheimer is of the view that offensive military capability states possess that is capable of using against other countries. So if America is more powerful, definitely China is worried about that, because China possesses offensive military capabilities that can create problem for China, and that is the reason China will also focus on its offensive military capability. Third, states can never be certain that other states will refrain from using those offensive military capabilities. That is in fact the reason for suspicion and mistrust. So if your neighbor has offensive military capability, you will never be happy about it, or you will never depend on the fact that your neighbor will always behave with you with equality, with mutual respect, and there will be no insecurity problem. Rather, if your neighbor is powerful, you will always feel insecure, you will always feel distrust in the military capability of your neighbor, as we can see it in case of India, because India is a major military power and economic power in the South Asian region, and that may be a reason that the South Asian, the small neighboring countries of South Asia, not all but some of the countries, they are always talking of India threat theory, or how India can pose a problem to them. So that is how Mearsheimer tries to explain your offensive capability is not taken very lightly or very loosely by your neighboring countries or your rival countries. Fourth, states seeks to maintain their survival, so that is their primary objective, or you can say it is a means to an end. So that is their final objective, that all countries are concerned about their survival. So what kind of methods, what kind of means you adopt may be different, but all are interested for this goal, which they consider as their ultimate goal, that is to maintain their survival. Fifth, states are rational actors, which means that they consider the immediate and long term consequences of their actions and think strategically about how to survive. So Mearsheimer particularly focuses on this aspect, that the states are rational actors because they know they have to survive in the international system, which is dominated by many powers, many small powers, many small countries, developed and developing countries. So different kind of countries are there, but if you have to survive in the international system, if you have to maintain your power position, so you have to think about the fact that you have to follow your action, you know about the limitation of your action, you know the strength of your action, because that may create problems to other countries. So, in that way you think strategically what you have to do, what you have not to do. Many Indian foreign policy scholars, they particularly consider this aspect, that many times India avoided to do something because many in India considered, or many in the government of India considered that as something offensive, or if not at least offensive, it will not make China happy. So, in order to make China happy, you sometimes not to take decisions that they may not like. So, that is how some people criticize in the policies of the earlier government. So, the point is you have to think about your means, your tools, and the consequences of your action, and that is how you have to think strategically about the kind of means and tools you are using for achieving your foreign policy objective. Though that was the point raised by Marcima. In an international system filled with such uncertainty regarding states' intentions, the best way for great powers to ensure their survival is to maximize power and pursue hegemony. So, the point raised by Marcima is that if you want to survive in the international system, so that is your final goal, that is no problem at all. But just surviving is something, it's common to all countries, but the powerful countries, they, in addition to survive in the international system, they want to pursue hegemony, or they will try to maximize their power, and the purpose is to maintain hegemonic position in the international system. So, this point makes Marcima different from Walters, because Walters is talking the objective of the states to get more and more security, so that can ensure their survival. But here Marcima is saying something that your survival is fine, but in addition to your survival, you also try to maintain hegemony in the international system. You want to maintain your preeminent in the international system, and that is the reason for many of the problems. The pursuit of regional and global hegemony among all the great powers will give rise to constant insecurity and potential for war. So, if everybody is focusing on hegemony, or if the major countries or major powers are focusing on hegemony, definitely that will lead to more insecurity and more war. This is called the tragedy of great power politics, because security seeking states are forced to engage in conflict to ensure their own security. So, the major powers are trying to accumulate more and more power, not just for their own survival, but to maintain their hegemony. So, that leads to more and more competition, more and more chances of war, and that is what he calls the tragedy of great power politics, because their objective is not just to ensure their security, their objective is to maintain their preeminent position or hegemony in the international system, that is applicable not to the superpowers, but also to the regional powers. So, that is how he wants to explain his concept of offensive realism, which he also called Walters and others as defensive realist. Both Walters and Marcima regards that the behavior of states is shaped by the anarchical structure of international relations. This is the point on the basis of which you can say Walters and Marcima, they are on the same page. But Marcima differs from Walters that excessive power is counterproductive because it provokes hostile alliances by other states. So, this is the point on the basis of which you can make a differentiation between Walters and Marcima. Walters is particularly talking of that kind of power that is enough for you to maintain your security, but Marcima is particularly talking of the fact that you need more and more power, you need to accumulate more power to maintain your hegemony, and this situation may lead to more and more hostile reactions by other countries. So, this is the point on the basis of which both differ, because one is talking of security. So, you acquire that power which is good enough and is not considered very offensive by your neighboring countries or maybe your competitors. The other is talking of the purpose of power to maintain hegemony, and that is putting both the thinkers in a different position. For Marcima, states seek hegemony, not just security and survival, as Walter says, and that is the reason why they become more aggressive than Walters portrays them. So the problem is, Walter's perception of security is basically, kind of defensive security. So you engage in that kind of power accumulation that is good for your security, and at the same time it does not threaten others. But Massima is talking about a different kind of security and survival, because your objective is not just to make yourself secure or survive in the competitive international system, rather your position or your objective is to maintain your preeminent position. So you can use Massima's theory of offensive realism to understand the present US policy towards China. After the Second World War, USA established a kind of liberal world order that actually gives preeminent position to the United States and also to its allies. And this kind of international system, although is somehow giving some kind of importance to China, but China is now, it is the second largest economy in the world, and because of that it has also tried to translate its economic power into political power, and it is trying to overthrow the system, or if not overthrow, at least creating an alternative system that will place China in a preeminent position, and it also may challenge US superpower status. So you can say that China is interested for a multipolar world, because that will give it equal status, or if not equal status, at least some more status in the international system, and it will also not give the United States the kind of preeminent status it enjoys at present. So the same China is thinking of a unipolar Asia, because that will give China the preeminent position, and it does not have any room for India. So the states are always thinking of their security, their survival, their preeminent position, and that is the reason why there will be a lot of insecurity, lot of instability in the international system. Great powers are always searching for opportunities to gain more power over their rivals, with hegemony as their final goal. So all the great powers, it is not a question of China, it is not a question of America, it is not a question of India. All the great powers, if you look at the history, you will find that all the great powers, they have always tried to maintain their hegemonic position, and they have always tried to contain those countries, those who can create a problem for them. We have so many examples in the history. His theory of offensive realism has been criticized for failing to explain the peaceful change and cooperation between the great powers, such as between Britain and the United States for the past century and longer. So if you think of Massima theory of offensive realism, it has given some good arguments, but in some circumstances, in some situations, it cannot explain the foreign policy behavior of countries, particularly those who are talking of cooperative foreign policy. The relationship between the United States and United Kingdom, that is the best example that how they focus on cooperative relationship, cooperative foreign policy for the last maybe 100 or more than 100 years. So the issue is sometimes in people in international politics, they think that United Kingdom is the 52 state of the United States, because sometimes it follows foreign policies, sometimes it follows policies that is in complete agreement with the United States. So the problem is what Massima is arguing, that to some extent can help you to explain the present US containment policy towards China, but it cannot explain the cooperative relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. Second, critics also argue, for example, that it fails to explain the emergence of supranational actors like the European Union. So if all the states are trying to maximize their power position, if all the states are trying to maintain hegemony, then why it happens that some states they surrender a part of their sovereignty for the supranational organizations like the European Union or maybe the ASEAN. So this point is not explained by Massima in a very satisfactory way. So that is again another limitation of his offensive realism. Now let me talk about neoclassical realism. While structural realists attribute the drivers of state behavior to the anarchical international system, some contemporary realists are skeptical of the notion that distribution of power can actually help you to understand the behavior of the state. So, the problem with the structural realism is that it is not necessary that we can understand the behavior of the states on the basis of power distribution only. So, that may be one of the variables, but it is not the only variable. Since the end of the Cold War, a group of scholars have attempted to move beyond the rigid assumptions of structural realism by adding a number of individual and domestic level factors into their explanation of world politics. So, the neoclassical realists are particularly focusing on the individual level of analysis, the domestic level of analysis, and it is their contention that you cannot understand the way international politics is functioning just by focusing on the systemic factor. That is important, but it is not sufficient. So, that is the point. While the relative distribution of power is recognized to be an important influence on the behavior of states, so are factors such as perception of the state leaders, state society relationship and state identity. So, distribution of power is important, no doubt about it, but there are other factors, other variables that is also important for understanding how the states operates in the international system, and they are particularly talking of the perception of state leaders about the distribution of power. So, it was Nehru perception of the distribution of power in the post Second World War period that helped India to go for non-alignment foreign policy. So, perception of leaders are also important, not just the distribution of power. Second, the state society relationship, whether you are living in a democratic country, whether your civil society is strong or not, whether you are living in a totalitarian country or authoritarian country, these things are also important for understanding international politics, not just the structure of international relations. Then your state identity, whether you are a democratic country, you are a non-democratic country, what is as a democratic country, what is your perception towards Myanmar, which is not a democratic country and which is again using the state power to silence the democratic opposition. So, as a democratic country, should India follow a policy towards Myanmar that is based on the restoration of democracy in that country rather than be a major power looking at its own interest at the cost of its own identity. So, there are so many issues that we cannot ignore for understanding the working of international politics. In attempting to build a bridge between structural realism and the unit level factors, this group of scholars has been characterized by Gideon Rose as the neoclassical realist, and particularly according to Stephen Walt, an American international relations scholar, the neoclassical realism places domestic politics are the intervening variable between the distribution of power and foreign policy behavior. So, if the structural realists are talking about the distribution of power and the classical realists are focusing on the foreign policy behavior, so the neoclassical realism it is a bridge between these two extreme positions, because they are talking of the intervening variable, that is the domestic politics. Thus, neoclassical realists agree with the neo-realist assumption that the primary factor that shapes foreign policy choices of states is their relative power at international level. So, basically the neoclassical realists are in the same page on the question of relative power distribution at the international level. They combine it with the classical realist view that defends the importance of national level variables, and it is related to the statecraft and state society interactions in forming the external policies of the state. So, if you look at the classical realism that gives importance to national level variables of statecraft and state society relationship, and if you look at the relative power distribution at the international level championed by the neo-realist, you will find that this classical realism is actually a common ground, because it bridges the two different positions taken by these two strands of realism. By combining the best elements of neo-realism with those of classical realism, neoclassical realists assume that anarchical structure and relative distribution of material power have a considerable impact on defining the state security interest. And if you combine the best elements of neo-realism that talks about international structure, you will get a satisfactory explanation of the way the present day international politics is actually functioning. But these systemic factors and not capable of dictating specific policies to the leaders. So, if you think of systemic factors, it may explain the working of international politics in some substantial way, but this is not enough because it cannot explain the specific kind of foreign policies followed by a particular leader. As I said about Nehru's policy of non-alignment during the distribution of power between the two superpowers in the post Second World War period. Thus, without taking into account the domestic variables, systemic factors do not explain too much in terms of specific foreign policy behavior. You have to take into account the domestic variables, not just systemic factors, because if you combine the domestic variables with the systemic factors, then it may help you to understand specific foreign policies of particular countries. One important intervening variable is the leaders themselves, namely how they perceive the distribution of power. I had already given you the example of Jawaharlal Nehru. So, how you think about power distribution at a particular time, that is again important. If you take the example of the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, he has a different understanding of power because he believes in a multipolar world and a world in which India becomes the pole because of its civilizational history, current power position. So, he follows a kind of foreign policy that is suitable for making the world multipolar. So, your leaders' perception about the level of power distribution or the kind of power distribution, that is again important. While structural realists assume that all states have similar set of interests, neo-classical realists argue that historically this has not been the case. So, all these structural realists, they will agree on this point that all the states they have the same kind of interest. You have permanent interest like survival, you have other interests which are changeable. So, that is fine, but according to the neo-classical realist, this is not true, because if you are a revisionist power, like Germany, before the Second World War, you have different interest. But if you are a status quoist power, your interests are different, like the present Germany. Or if you are following a policy of isolationism as the United States did in before the Second World War, its interest was different. Now it is a superpower, so its interests are different. So, there is a difference between your country's interest, and that difference is based on your standing in international politics, whether you are a revisionist state, you are a status quoist country, or what the Chinese are now presently doing vis-a-vis America, that they are challenging the preeminent position of America. So, in that case you can consider the current policies of China as a kind of revisionist policy. Another intervening variable in state power is that the neo-classical realists argue that states possess different capacities to translate the various elements of national power into state power, and thus contrary to Walters, all states cannot be treated as like units. Similarly, states have different dimensions of power, they are having different elements of power. You can take the example of Germany or Japan, they are economically very powerful, but in terms of international politics they are not playing any important kind of role. Now Japan has changed its policy, but what about Australia? So, the point is, even if you are economically powerful, that does not mean that you will follow a kind of very active foreign policy, what the neo-realists are saying. So, the problem is how you translate your notional power into real power, how you translate your economic power into military power, into political power, that is again important, and this is the point on the basis of which neo-classical realism differs from neo-realism. Neo-classical realists also focus on explaining what goes on in terms of pressure of international structure on the one hand and the decision made by the state leaders on the other. So, as I said, they are combining the best elements of neo-realism and the best elements of classical realism, and combining the pressure of international structure, what the neo-realists are talking about, and the decision made by the state leaders, what the classical realists are talking about. So, they are combining the best elements of these two factors, power distribution in the international system and the decision of the state leaders. Neo-classical realism also seeks to introduce an element that all other realists ignore or even downplay in the analysis, that is the internal characteristics of the states. as I said, whether you are democratic country, you are an authoritarian country, that have a lot of consequences on your foreign policy decisions. In brief, neoclassical realism could be considered as an approach that sages the middle ground in realistic perspective. So, if you think of two different traditions of realism, one is led by the classical realist, the other is led by the neo-realist like Walters or Massima, then the neoclassical realism is the middle ground, or the occupy the middle position in the realist perspective. Given the increasing importance of some domestic variables such as public opinion, civil society and foreign policy process, adding that the non-material factors are also important, which was ignored by the other realist views. So, these important factors like public opinion, the role of nowadays social media is playing a very important role. You are giving comments on so many international issues, you are tweeting on so many international issues, you are writing in the social media, and these are also taken seriously by the government. If there is a crisis and you write for help, you write for assistance, the Foreign Ministry of India, the Minister of External Affairs, it takes note of it, and they are also accountable to the parliament, to the public opinion, to the opposition, to the court system in India. So, it means these factors are important, which we cannot ignore in the analysis of the realist tradition in international politics. So, non-material factors are important, which was ignored by the structural realist. Moreover, its inclination to combine both the outside and inside elements to establish a solid analytical framework for not only states' foreign policies, but also international politics offers without doubt a promising prospect for the study of international relations in the 21st century. So, the classical realists they were talking of a divide that they considered as great divide between the domestic factor and the international factor. That was, and even the structural realists, they were one step ahead. They thought that there is nothing happening at the domestic level has actually any impact on international politics or the structure of international system. But in this neoclassical realism, it actually offers middle ground analysis or a middle ground position, and particularly it is not acknowledging, or it is not accepting earlier division of the outside and inside elements, because as I said, public opinion, your legal system, your role of opposition parties, they are all important for understanding how you operate in the international system. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. We discussed about John Mearsheimer's idea of offensive realism, which provides a different account of the power dynamics that operates in an anarchical system. Mearsheimer differs from Kenneth Walters that excessive power is counterproductive because it provokes hostile alliances by other countries. To him, in an international system filled with such uncertainty regarding states' intentions, the best way for great powers is to ensure their survival is to maximize power and pursue hegemony, which cause constant security competition with the potential for war. Then we discussed about the neoclassical realists who argue that anarchical structure and relative distribution of material power have a considerable impact on defining the state's security interest. Then we discussed about neoclassical realists who argue that anarchical structure and relative distribution of material power have a considerable impact on defining the state's security interest. Neoclassical realists place domestic politics such as state leadership, bureaucratic politics, and public opinion as an intervening variable between the distribution of power and foreign policy behavior on the global stage. In the next lecture, we will cover another important variant of realism called subaltern realism, given by Muhammad Ayub. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you once again.